Welcome to season 5 of Vaughan Socks, and for this season we're going to look at five people I lived with as a child and who each had an influence on me, and you'll see why there are 5 people all living together. It seems rather a lot, doesn't it? And we're going to look at my grandmother, at my aunt, we're going to look at my uncle and my father and my mother. That's 5, you see, and we're going to start with my maternal grandmother. Come into the garden, Maud, for the black bat night has flown. Come into the garden, Maud, I am here at the gate alone. I am here at the gate alone. Well, that's from a poem by Tennyson. He wrote in 1855, and Maud. And in fact, my grandmother was called Maud, and I always associate that song with her. Not that I hear it very much nowadays. And she was born in 1887 in London. She was the eldest child, and she was the first of her family to be born who was naturalised, born in England, because her father came from Denmark. He'd arrived from Denmark a few years before, from Copenhagen and Aalborg before that, and he married a girl called Polly Allen, and his name was Johan Krarup, and he always spoke with a very heavy accent. People couldn't understand him. He never really lost his accent. My father could understand him though, because he said he listened carefully to what he said. My father understood a bit of German and no Danish, but the accent was sort of quite heavy. So he listened to what he said, and he said that they were a lively couple. When they came to stay, Johan and Polly, they had 8 children, by the way, and you could understand. I mean, there's a lot, but in those days maybe not so much, because a lot of people had lots of children. But he said that when they came to stay, he said even when they were in the 80s, you were kept awake at night by all their, having it away. And he said, so there's plenty of guttural gruntings, I should think, taking place. Having said that, the Krarups were terribly respectable. They'd never be seen inside a pub or anything like that. He was an accountant in London, in Nottingham, where he met Polly, and he was an accountant, and they had this, maybe because he was an immigrant, I don't know, but they had this sort of respectability thing about themselves. They were very witty as well, and clever people. One of the things that Polly was worried about was that she was worried about sex outside marriage, not obviously inside it, as you've just heard. So when the newspaper arrived every morning, she got there first, or the magazines, and she cut out with a pair of scissors any photographs of attractive-looking women, or indeed any women, so that he wouldn't lust after them. And so she sort of kept control of him, and she crossed the road if she saw with him, if she saw an attractive woman coming towards them, all that sort of thing. She's very sort of worried about keeping him in the family, and of course she did, because I had 8 children. But as I say, my grandmother Maud Alexandra Krarup was born in 1887, and she was very respectable herself, and she didn't have any boyfriends or anything like that. So it was a bit of a shock when the parents found out that she was actually beginning to see somebody, and she was 24 years old. Hello, hello, who's your lady friend? Who's the little girlie by your side? I've seen you with a girl or two. Oh, 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 I am surprised at you. Hello, hello, don't you think you can? Don't you think your ways you ought to mend? It isn't the girl I saw you with at Brighton. Who's your lady friend? Well, Maud was a lady friend. The problem was that the boyfriend, she was, as I said, 24, but the boyfriend was not yet 18. He was 17, and so they were going out together. And Maud, I don't know how they met, but they were a bit worried about it because he was from the wrong side of the tracks. Or maybe I got it from him. His job, one of the jobs he had, was playing a piano in a pub, and it might have been there that Maud met him. I don't know how she got into the pub, but his father also ran a company called the Nottingham Catering Company, which was also considered very sniffy about catering for places and things like that, because they didn't like business people, the Crarups. They were very sniffy about it. So, especially with the age difference between 17, 18 and 24, they were really worried about it. But Mama, he's making eyes at me. Mama, he's awfully nice to me. Mama, he's almost breaking my heart. He is beside me. Mercy, let my conscience guide me. Mama, he wants to marry me. Be my honeybee. Every minute he gets bolder. Now he's leaning on my shoulder. Mama, he's kissing me. Every minute he gets bolder. Now he's leaning on my shoulder. Ma, he's kissing me. Well, it didn't stop at kissing because in a month or so, poor old Maud found herself pregnant, and you can imagine what this went down like with the Crarup family. Basically, she was cast out. And the embarrassment of the whole thing, and I think she was sent to Sheffield to have the baby. But the situation was basically a shotgun marriage, and I don't know. He was very in love with her, and she was in love with him. But why would they want him to marry a sort of working class boy who played the piano in a pub? Maybe I inherited that from him. I don't know. I think I probably did. Anyway, they were in love. So let's play a song that I know Maud said he sang to her. If you were the only girl in the world and I were the only boy, nothing else would matter in the world today. We could go on loving in the same old way. A Garden of Eden, just made for two, with nothing to mar our joy. I would say such wonderful things to you. There would be such wonderful things to do if you were the only girl in the world and I were the only boy. Well, they didn't end with the first child, who was born in 1911, my Aunt Irene, who we'll be talking about tomorrow, after the shotgun marriage, which they, of course, the Crarups didn't attend. And they were to have two more kids, and my mother, who was born a couple of years later, and then my uncle Charles, both of whom we were talking about, who were born 2 years after that. But then something terrible happened. World War I, and Maud was very worried about Jack Butler, her husband, new husband, their 3 little children, about him going to war at all, and she tried to stop him, persuade him not to go, and he didn't want to go. He was no sort of like rabid, ready to go off and fight on the Western Front, and she tried to stop him by all sorts of means. I don't know the details, but I know she did. But anyway, he decided to enlist, and he enlisted with the Yorkshire Regiment, but then was immediately transferred to a regiment in London, the Middlesex Regiment, not because he was from there, but because by the time that this happened in 1916, with conscription around the corner, soldiers were being killed on the Western Front to such a degree that new recruits and even people already in regiments were transferred to other regiments overnight, even though they had no connection with the regiment at all. Well, what happened on August the 16th, 1917, and it still, in my memory, it's still, not that I can remember it, but it was part of my memory as a child. It was sort of like emblazoned there. On August the 16th, 1917, Jack Butler, at the age of 24, was blown to smithereens on the Western Front at Ypres in the Third Battle of Ypres, and his body was never found. And when Maud was learnt about this through telegram in those days, the worst thing was seeing a telegram boy coming around the corner, as you can imagine. And she was standing on the front steps. There's 3 steps in the house they had in Sheffield, with the 3 little kids who were, 5, 3 and 1 at the time. And he handed the telegram, and she collapsed and fell right down the steps and had to be taken up to a room and lay down, and wasn't well for a week or 2 afterwards. He banged her head on the steps, and sometimes they just collapsed, which must have happened thousands of times at that time. By Franz Lehár, and it's called A Merry Widow Waltz, from a 1905 musical play. And I used to play it as a child because I quite liked the song when I was about 11 years old, and I had it as my sort of like my theme tune before I started to play to the family and things, which they wanted me to do so they could dance around and that sort of thing. But Maud left the room when this was played because it was called The Merry Widow. You can obviously see why, but I always associate it with her, with my grandmother. So here was my grandmother living with these 3 little children, and on a war widow's pension, which was about £3 a week in those days. I don't know what it would be today, but it's very little. And when she moved back to Nottingham, she was given a job taking in washing from the Crarups, from her sisters, and had married better and were living quite well off, and of course her mother and father, and so she became a sort of washerwoman for the family. Can you imagine that? And they've obviously thought this destitute woman had done 2 things that have been inflicted with. One was being a shotgun marriage to a boy far younger than her, which is embarrassing, and then they had the situation where he was killed in the First World War, and she didn't have any money to live on, and so they felt they're probably doing her a favour. But and that's how things were in those days. But then the children were expected to bring some money in, like going and fetching the washing, but doing other things and cleaning steps and things for people, and scrubbing them and that sort of thing. But my mother took a job. She left school at 12, and officially did not leave it, but she did leave school at 12, as did her sister Irene, and they took jobs in shops and part-time work and things like that. and she ended up, my mother did, selling programmes at the Theatre Royal Nottingham to the audience, and somehow from there she ended up as a hoofer on the stage, and you can imagine what the Crarups thought of that. So poor old Maud was in a sort of like in the shit in three ways, really. Lost her husband, she was married in a shotgun, and now she got a daughter actually on the stage. Don't send your daughter on the stage. My grandmother didn't marry again because there was a dearth of men around anyway after the First World War, but also she said that she didn't want to because she had these small little children, and she thought that any man who was in it, there weren't many interested because she's a very pretty woman, that she didn't know how they would treat their stepchildren. And in fact there were cases of, you can imagine, of men taking on stepchildren and not treating them very well. So she decided not to marry again, which is a great shame, really. But then something happened in her life, or rather not to her, but it had consequences for her, and that was my father arrived and started courting my mother. I wonder why you keep me waiting, Charmaine cries in vain. I wonder where bluebirds are mating. Will you come back again? I wonder if I keep on praying, will our dreams be the same? I wonder if you ever think of me too, Charmaine's waiting just for you. Well, that was a popular song at the time when my mother and father met in the late 20s. The thing was that my father and my mother, when she met my father, he was in his mid-30s, and my mother had only just turned 16. She was on the stage in the West End, and it was considered, a bit sort of racy, this was. But some of the Grillsons particularly they didn't turn up at the wedding. They were appalled that he was marrying a showgirl. And but anyway, I don't know what the Crarups thought, but Mater, Maud, thought it was very good indeed, because Herman, my father, had a job. He was a schoolmaster. He had been to Oxford. He came from a middle-class world. It was a completely different world, and she saw it as an opportunity, not just financial, economic, for herself and her children who were growing up, but also sort of like a climb back into a middle-class world that she had dropped out of after meeting and marrying Jack. So anyway, my father went ahead with the marriage against the wishes of his family, the Grills family. And of course he found that when he married my mother, that he wasn't just marrying her, he was marrying my grandmother, he was marrying my Auntie Irene, and he was marrying my Uncle Charles. So in other words, he was taking on the whole family, economically and spiritually, in every way you can think of. And when he got a job in Newark-on-Trent as a headmaster, there's an opportunity there for my mother to not only find a better house and everything like this, but also the prestige of being the headmaster's wife, you see. She was only, 21 years old herself when this happened. You can imagine what that was like, being catapulted from being a showgirl to being the wife of a headmaster in a little provincial town. Anyway, my mother wanted to go up market, and my the house my father found, first he found a place called York House in Newark, which they rented for a year or two, and then they went to 121 Farndon Road, which is a bit further down the road. And my mother said, can't it have a name, like a sort of stately home, like York House or something? So my father, of course, came up with Dane House, because when you think about it, it's rather odd, because he was the only non-Dane among the lot of them. As for Maud, what were they going to call her? Well, they didn't know what to do, because my mother was pregnant with me, and they thought, well, we don't want to call her grandmother. They didn't like that idea. But the problem is that they called their mother, Maud, was called by her children, she was called Mam. Now, Mam sounds very nice. Mam, you call the Queen Mam. But in the north of England, Mam was considered a bit, a sort of working class thing that people said. That's what mothers still are, in a way, still called Mam. So she certainly wasn't called Mummy or Mother. So my father was tasked with the job of coming up with a more salubrious name, something better. And he came up with the Latin Mater, or Alma Mater. You say when you put Alma together, we don't know exactly how it's pronounced. I think politically it's probably pronounced Mater, like Pater and Mater. But anyway, she was called Mater, and so from that moment on, Maud, from the time I was born onwards, she became Mater. I was looked after by Mater quite a lot. She was very attentive. She did all the gardening, she did the cooking, and the cleaning, really. And she was very attentive to me. Obviously, she had the experience of bringing up 3 children. But it was the Second World War, and she was worried that she might lose her son, Charles, who was about the age when her own husband had died, 24, and she said to my father, she said, well, I'll get him out gardening, and when he's out gardening I'll get a spade, and when he's not looking I'll get him soft pair of shoes on, I'll chop off his toes so he can't be called up, can't be held up. And then my mother heard this, and she said to my father, again to bail them out in terms of coming up with something that would sort of beyond their own ken. And she said, how can we get him out of the army, being called up, or navy, or what it was. And my father, it's a bit embarrassing, because my mother had joined the Peace Pleasure Union, and my father was a naval officer, a Wavy Navy officer in signals at that time. And so my father came up with a wheeze for Charles, which pleased Mater very much, and that was a conscientious objector. But that's the story about Charles. I'll tell you about that, but all I can say is that my father told him what to say, and they pulled it off, and he ended up just looking after prisoners of war and not going to war himself at all. So in a way she saved his life, I assume so anyway. It's like possible. But she did hate war, and I remember sending apparently she sent a telegram to Churchill after the Dieppe raid, when all those people were killed in 1942, I think it was. She clipped out a photograph of my of Churchill from the newspaper. It's clipping out of pictures, and wrote murderer across it and sent it off, posted it off to Downing Street, because she was so upset about it all. And of course she remembers Gallipoli and the other sort of Churchillian sort of mistakes and things like that. So she sent it. And in fact, when I was at the Slade, I made a piece of work about that, about that particular incident, a sculpture. But anyway, so Charles wasn't enlisted, and my grandmother Mater now was moved to Skegness, to Chapel St Leonard's, where my sister, my Aunt Irene had now got a house, and I was shuffled off there when I failed 11 plus to go to Skegness Secondary Modern. And Meta looked after me. She did the cooking and things and welcomed me back, and I got very close to her, very fond of her, and she was, very, very attentive to me. And I remember coming back one day from school. A boy had said a big boy had said I had to do this and that and the other, and I said I don't know if to do it or not. And she said to me, she said, well. When somebody tells you to do something, always think what's in it for them, whoever it is, and it's something I actually remembered. In fact, it helped me a lot in my career, because I thought, particularly in art school, where you taught something or you received opinion and you question it, because in art school you taught to question everything you taught in a way, especially in fine art, so you can come up with the original ideas and so on. So and it's something I taught myself. So she said this to me, and it stuck with me. So in 1963 there was something called the Profumo affair. You may have remembered it. And there was somebody called Mandy Rice Davis, who was a showgirl. That was the polite word, a showgirl. I think she was 19. Anyway, she ended up in court, in the High Court, in which there was a case put about Lord Astor, who said was having an affair with her, was sleeping with her, and so on. And of course, he was asked in court. Mandy Rice Davis was there, asked her. Did you ever sleep with this girl? And he stood up and he said, I've never have. In fact, I've never met her before. And the barrister for Lord Astor turned to the jury, and he says, well, he said, what do you think of that? And he turned to Mandy Rice Davis and he said, well, what do you think of that then, Miss Davis? And she said, him saying that, and she said, well, he would, wouldn't he? And that the next day the newspapers just changed it round a bit, gave it a bit more sort of expressive for sort of a newspaper thing, but still the same sentiment. So the saying, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? And that was across all the newspapers. And because a peer of the realm had been sort of shown up by a showgirl, and nobody liked that idea, did they? The reason I mention this is that, well, he would say that, wouldn't he, comes back to Meta saying those things to me many times. So it wasn't a surprise to me at all, or in any of the family, my family, that Mandy Rice Davis said this, but to most people I thought it was quite shocking. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he, was a sort of response to anything you were told, basically. And she taught me that when I was 7 years before the Mandy Rice Davis system thing staying, and it's something I've actually remembered all my life. What else did she do? Well, there's something a bit more important than that. In 1944, I was in my pram, and a German bomber came over, flying low, about 50 feet, and it was machine gunning. And she ran out and pulled the pram out of the way, and they just saved my life. The bullet holes are still on the walls of the Dane House, as it's called still, and she actually saved my life by doing that. So I owe her that as well. Apart from, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Being sceptical about what you're told every time, to make sure that don't always believe everything you're told, and so she. She helped me in at least two ways like that. Well, she also cooked very good soup. I'll say that for her. Excellent soup. But she did like she didn't like, of course, that waltz, but the Merry Widow. But she did like Strauss. So let's see if we can play some Strauss. can see her now being waltzed round the sitting room by my mother, or sometimes my father was roped in for her to dance to that. Well, that's Mater, Maud Alexandra Crarup, and tomorrow we're going to talk about Auntie Irene. But in the meantime, here's a picture of Mater in the 1930s.